We're talking about the Great Tribulation hour. We're right in the heart of the book of Revelation. And we are looking at some of the most complicated scriptures and concepts and doctrines. I mean, people have a hard time understanding this 3.5 years, this 3.5 year period, this Great Tribulation period. And so we have been figuring out what the Bible says about that, the truth about it. Okay, so we're on part 2 today. So let's continue with part 2 right now. The 1260 days of the Great Tribulation. This is part 2. The 1260 days of the Great Tribulation. Okay? Now these are the terms that are used. 1260 days, 42 months, and a time times and half a time. And the question is, are these the same period or different periods? And we've been answering that over the last few weeks. We will be connecting these 3 terms, proving that they are referring to the same time period. The 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. Okay? Now again, the important keys that we've been focusing on to understand this are these 5 points right here. We have to understand what a time times and half a time is. We've already done that. We have to understand what the war against the saints is, and we've done that already. Now we're getting into the concepts that involve the 1260 days, which is protection and persecution, the concepts of how these things relate to one another during this time period. It's a very important concept. Number 3. Okay, number 4 is how God uses different terms for the 3.5 year time period, depending on who he's talking to and what he's revealing to us about that time period. He calls it different names. That's what throws a lot of scholars off, as they don't understand point 4, and that God will call the same 3.5 year time period different names. And of course, number 5, how everything fits together. All right, now this is the connections we've been making over the last few weeks. There are 4 simple, explicit connections that identify the Great Tribulation period. We've already done the first one. We're done with that. A time times and half a time connects to the war against the saints, and we understand that from previous Bible studies. So the second thing we're looking at here now today, the second connection that we're making today in part 2, because the time times and half a time connects to the war with the saints, that was part 1. Now we're into part 2. Today's our first day doing part 2, and it's about the 1260 days term and how it connects to a time times and half a time. So in part 1, all we really did was connect a time times and half a time, that term, to a war against the saints. And we saw how the chapters and all connect. Well, actually, we're going to go over that. So let's just not jump ahead too much here. So here's part 2. Part 2 is 1260 days, how it connects to a time times and half a time. Okay? Part 2 gets more complicated. If you thought part 1 was complicated, part 2 is more complicated. Okay, now here's some important points you have to understand about 1260 days. Are you guys with me? Are you guys here to learn? Important points concerning the 1260 days. These are 4 ideas you need to understand about the term 1260 days. First, the term 1260 days refers to protection. Always know that. We're going to see that. Every time 1260 days is mentioned, it's always in reference to protection, always. Also, point two, 1260 days of protection also happens while the Antichrist makes war against the saints. Now that is a stinger, because what's up with protection if there's still war against the saints? And that's what we're going to learn. We're going to learn today that there's 2 different groups. So that's an important thing to understand about the 1260 days. Although it refers to a time of protection, this time of protection goes on for some while the Antichrist is making war against the saints with others. That's an important point you have to understand. Point number 3 you have to understand is that 1260 days of protection is not for everyone. Do you hear me? Now that would make sense, because point 2 says this protection happens while the Antichrist is making war. So that means some of the Christians are going to be persecuted while others are going to be protected, and that gives us point 3. The 1260 days of protection is not for everyone. Simple as can be. Point 4 about the 1260 days you're going to learn today is that when the 1260 days of protection ends, it does come to an end. Some of the protected will be killed while a remnant remains protected. Now listen to this. Talk about complicated. First of all, there's a time of protection. Secondly, there's a time of protection while there's war going on against some Christians. Thirdly, there's a time of protection is not for everyone, obviously, then. And fourthly, the time of protection does come to an end, but only for some and not for everybody. Give me a 7 if you understand those 4 points. I'll repeat the last one. When the time of protection comes to an end, it only ends for some and not for everybody. That means the ones that were protected will no longer be protected, but some will still remain protected. So we have the two groups. We have a group that's protected and a group that's not protected. But under the group that is protected, some of them will lose their protection at the end of the 1260 days, while some will not. Now, I hope you understand that. I'm going to say that last part again, just so you understand. There's two groups. One's protected, one's not protected. They have no protection at all. Then we have this group that's protected. They get divided into two groups because at the end of the 1260 days, some of them lose their protection while some do not. And so we're going to show you the scriptures. It's going to be clear as day. It's going to be like a light bulb goes off. We're going to cover the entire chapter 12 of Revelation, and you're going to see this with your own eyes, okay? And then you'll start to understand why people get this wrong so much and why it's so hard to understand. But if you got these points right here understood, you will not get confused. All right. So let's do a review of point 1 or part 1 that we did last week. It's going to go by real quick. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, because we've already spent several weeks on it. We're going to review what we've learned in part 1. This is part 2, connecting 1260 days to a time, times, and half a time, part 2. But real quickly, in case you're catching this new here, part 1, and here's what we learned. Part 1, we learned how the term a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years, how it connects to something called a war with the saints. And that's what we learned. We've been learning in the last few weeks, all part 1. Okay, and these are the chapters. Revelation 12, Revelation 13, Daniel 12, Daniel 7. Here we go. There's actually 5 chapters on the left. Daniel at the bottom has 2 chapters in it. So 5 chapters talks about the 3.5-year Great Tribulation period. On the right are the 3 terms, the only 3 terms that are used to describe a Great Tribulation period. 42 months, 1260 days, a time, times, and half a time. Okay, now from the chapters that we've learned about so far, the four chapters in the 2 books, Revelation and Daniel, the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel are the only 2 books that talk about the Great Tribulation hour. Well, there's others, but that actually call it by name. Only one of these chapters does not mention the words a time, times, and half a time, and that's Revelation 13. It calls it a different name, 42 months. But it talks, all 4 of these chapters talk about a war with the saints, and that's how they connect. These 4 chapters here connect. First connection has 2 steps. The first connection has 2 steps. First, where do we see a time, times, and half a time? What does it mean? It means 3.5 years. Where is it at? Revelation 12, Daniel 12, and Daniel 7, right? The next step of connection 1, because first connection has 2 steps. First step is to find out where the term times, times, and half a time is. The second step of connection 1 is to identify the war with the saints and how it connects to this 3.5-year time period. And so we see a war with the saints in the book of Daniel. Daniel 7 and Daniel 12 talk about a war with the saints, and it calls it a time, times, and half a time. It says there's 3.5 years where there's going to be terrible war against the Christians and believers and God's people, right? And then in Revelation 12, we get that same language, and the term times, time, and half a time is in Revelation 12. So it's talking about the same time period Daniel's talking about, right? So that's how we made that connection. Revelation 13 does not mention the term a time, times, and half a time. It calls it 42 months, but it does talk about a war against the saints. That's why we know that it's included in this connection and understanding of scriptures because it's talking about the same war. It just happens to call it 42 months instead. But that's another part to our study that's coming up later. I don't want you to get confused. All we learned about in our first connection is how these chapters all connect to the same time period, a time, times, and half a time, and they all talk about a war against the saints. And that's what they all have in common. So that's the first connection. The first step was to identify a time, times, and half a time. The second step was to bring in Revelation 13 because it talks about the same war against the saints as the other ones do. That's how we connected all that together. All right? Revelation 13 calls that time period 42 months. Now that's a part coming up in the future we're going to study, just quickly throwing that at you. Because it's calling it 42 months, we can also know that that's the same 3.5-year time period that Daniel's talking about. Daniel calls it a time, times, and half a time. Revelation calls it a time, times, and half a time. Revelation 13, however, calls it 42 months, but that's another study, right? That's part 3. That's coming up next in the next part, right down there, part 3, you see, out of all the 4 connections we're going to make. Today we're on part 2 still. We're learning about the 1260 days itself and how it connects to a time, times, and half a time, okay? We're learning about right here. Revelation 12 brings in the term 1260 days. All right, Revelation 12 brings in, this is the first connection. Now we're going to move on to the second connection. All right, everything was connected by a war against the saints. Okay, we're kind of getting redundant here. Let's go faster. Okay, before we move on to the second connection, let's add another perspective to the terms being used. I want us to look at this idea here about why is God using these different terms real quick? Why doesn't he just call it all the same thing? I mean, why isn't it just called 3.5 years? Simple, make it simple. Right? So that's why we're wondering, is this the same time period or not? Sometimes it's called 1260 days, sometimes 42 months, a time, times, and half a time. So we're going to look at this a different way to see if we can understand this a little bit. Now, each term is used twice, except for the last one. The reason why I'm putting it for 2 times here, I want us to make a comparison. In the book of Daniel, it's only mentioned twice. In the entire book of Daniel, the Great Tribulation hour is called a time, times, and half a time, and it's only mentioned 2 times. Okay? Right down here, let's take a look at this. I think this will help us figure this out. 2 times in the book of Daniel. 2 times in the book of Daniel, that's it. 2 times in the Revelation, we have 42 months. And 2 times in Revelation, we have 1260 days. 2, 2, 2, 6 altogether. I'm just making some associations. I'm trying to figure out what's God telling us. Sometimes, guys, you can see things that God's doing by associations. And that's how I learned that the 1260 days was only about protection. One day I just simply associated it with the other time I saw it used. And it just so happened to be protecting the 2 witnesses. And I'm like, wait a minute. And I thought to myself, is 1260 days only referring to protection? And I went and looked it up, and I studied it closer, and I was amazed to see that whenever 1260 days is mentioned in Revelation 11 and Revelation 12, it's talking about protecting someone. And then I said, well, what about 42 months? I looked up the 2 scriptures that say 42 months, and sure enough, it was referring to the Antichrist or Antichrist unbelievers having power. And I was like, well, isn't this interesting? And then I saw a time, times, and half a time in the book of Daniel. It only mentions really a war against the saints. But in Revelation chapter 12, it connects it to a time of protection. And then I started realizing 42 months is a time of power to the Antichrist. 1260 days is a time of protection to the saints. And these are happening at the same exact time. Now, we're going to show you this in detail and prove it to you. But that's kind of where we're at with it. Let's continue to go on. Why 2 times each? Here's the 3 times that the term a time, times, and half a time is used. And we see in Daniel right here, Daniel is twice, all right? In Revelation, only 1 time. This time right here is very, very significant in why it's used in the book of Revelation. We're going to figure that out, and you're going to see amazingly what happens. The third one connects us to the other terms. So God's taking that time, times, and half a time from the book of Daniel, He's bringing it into the book of Revelation to let us know he's referring to that time in Daniel. Let's go ahead and see what we got here in our notes. Okay? This time and half a time is brought into the book of Revelation to connect the prophecies. Can I get an amen if you're with me? God is saying to us in John's prophetic book, Revelation, he's saying that this times and half a time is what Daniel was talking about. God wants us to go back to Daniel and read about that in Daniel 7 and Daniel 12. Because God is saying that this is the same time period that Daniel talked about. And we're going to see how that happens in Revelation 12. He's bringing it into these. This is the connection that is so critically important to understanding that all these terms are the same term. If we understand the connection between a times and half a time in the book of Daniel, how God brings that term into Revelation 12, talking about a 3.5 year time period that links protection and war together. It links protection and war together. Then we're going to start seeing how all these terms are nothing more than the same exact time period. 3.5 years is all we're looking at here. Okay, so we're going to continue to work it though. God shows us these are the same time periods through this one connection in Revelation chapter 12. Okay, so let's move on. Part 2, we will connect 1260 days and show that it is the same 3.5 year period in all the other chapters, same time. Something quick to think about. What do we got here? Something quick to think about before we get going. Notice 12:6. 12:6. See, God does these things to help us learn. I think he does, on purpose. 12:6 is interesting because Daniel 12:6 says something and Revelation 12:6 says something, and they're complementary to one another. Check it out. Here we have Daniel 12:6 on top, saying, how long shall it be till the end of these things? Talking about the war against the saints and the power of the Antichrist. Go read Daniel chapter 12. You'll see that it's about the time of the end and a great time of trouble that's coming upon the world. How long shall it be, he asks in verse 6, until these things end? Revelation 12:6. 12:6 again, we see 1260 days. And we understand, we're going to read here, that this is a time of protection, that she's going to flee into the wilderness and be protected for 3.5 years. And I just thought that was an interesting connection between Daniel and Revelation. This is not the only connection. And you might say, oh, this is just a circumstance or a coincidence. And it could be, but it also happens to be the very chapter, Revelation 12, that talks about a times and half a time. The only chapter in Revelation that mentions the same term that Daniel mentions. So I don't think it's a coincidence. I think God's deliberately showing us something here. All right, you guys with me? How long shall it be? All right, now here we go with Daniel chapter 7 on the top part and Daniel chapter 12 on the bottom. This is the book of Daniel, 3 different scriptures, 2 different chapters. We're looking at the same question that we saw before up above. How long shall it be in the book of Daniel? How long shall it be? And we're looking at this associated with war against Christians, against believers. It says wearing out the saints in verse 25. It says scatter the power of the holy people in verse 7, Daniel 12:7. It's all about how long will this time period of pressure be? How long is this pressure going to be? And it says in both chapters, a times and half a time. Daniel talks about a 3.5 year time period. This is 2 different chapters talking about the same time period. Now you could try and make a case that this is 2 different wars with Christians and 2 different 3.5 year periods. And you could try to make that stretch. And it would be harder to believe that than just simply saying Daniel is referring to the same time period. The Antichrist is going to come to power, and he's going to be given 42 months. We learn about that in Revelation 13. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years. How long is Daniel talking about here? 3.5 years. 3.5 years of what? Of power against believers, Christians, God's people. And so it doesn't make sense that each one of these terms are another 3.5 years, making it 7. And then when you get to Revelation, it's another 3.5, making it 10.5. And then when you get to, Revelation 11, there's another 3.5. It's ridiculous to think that. It's not the case. It's easier and simpler and more logical to believe that these are just simply talking about the same time period. But you can believe whatever you want. Okay, it's mentioned 2 times in the book of Daniel. It's mentioned 1 time in the book of Revelation. That term right here, this time period, this time of great tragedy and terror to the Christian community and God's people for 3.5 years in the book of Daniel is mentioned in Revelation chapter 12. All right? So we see a time, times, and half a time. Well, it's coming up. Actually, this is not the right passage. What I'm trying to tell you is it's 3.5 years of protection. I'll have to change that slide, but it is coming up. Let's see. Revelation chapter 12. We're going to see when we read the whole passage. Daniel 12 at the top. Daniel 12:6. How long shall it be? Revelation 12:6. 1260 days. And Revelation 12:14. A time, times, and half a time. How long shall it be? We get the answer. We get the answer in Daniel, and we get the answer in Revelation chapter 12. She's protected for 1260 days. And at the same time, there's war against the Christians for 3.5 years. Protection for 3.5 years, and war against the Christians for 3.5 years. And it's at the same exact time. When she flees into the wilderness. There is no indication, and we're going to see this coming up. We're going to read it word by word coming up in a minute. There's no indication that these are two separate time periods. We can show you that very, very simply. Okay? So a time, times, and half a time is mentioned one time in the book of Revelation, connecting it to Daniel. The key that identifies these as the same time period of protection. The key that identifies these as the same time period is protection. And this is how we're going to prove to you that 1260 days and a time, times, and half a time is actually the same 3.5 year time period. The key to understanding it is Revelation chapter 12, and it's the protection we see being given to the people of God. Okay? Look what it says in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6. Look what it says in Revelation chapter 12, verse 14. So we're looking at verse 6 and verse 14. The woman is fleeing into the wilderness, and at the top part, verse 6, it says for 1260 days. What's going to happen to her for 1260 days? She's going to be fed. Look what it says. Verse 6, that they should feed her there. That they should feed her there. That's the top one. Okay? Now, a few verses later, more information is coming to us. God's revealing a little bit more details in a few verses down. And he says again, the woman flees into the wilderness where she is nurtured. Look what it says. She is nurtured. Now, you have to ask yourself a really important question. Is this woman fleeing into the wilderness two different times from the Antichrist? Where she's going to be protected for two separate 3.5 year periods? What is she going to do? Is she going to go in Revelation chapter 6, flee into the wilderness for 1260 days and then come back out? And then in verse 14, she's going to have to go back into the wilderness where she's nurtured again for what, a 3.5 year period again? Does that make sense to anybody? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. And when we read Revelation chapter 12, you're going to see why God is saying it two times. And that's what's going to be a light bulb moment for all of you out there. You're going to see, oh, God's basically showing us something. He's telling us two different times that this event is going to take place. What ties them together is what? The nourishing, the protection. We're seeing that a time, times, and half a time also in Revelation 12:14 also. Look what it says. She is nourished for a time, times, and half a time. Now, this is the only place in the Bible, in Daniel and in Revelation, where we see the term time, times, half a times. That's usually associated with war against the saints. We saw in Daniel 7 and Daniel 12. Usually, it's only about the war against the Christians. But now we're seeing a time, times, and half a time in reference to protection. So that tells us that a time, times, and half a time is not only about the war against the Christians. Daniel did not tell us that, did he? Daniel does not tell us in Daniel 7 and Daniel 12, how long shall it be? The war against the Christians, the wearing out the saints, the scattering the power of the holy people. He does not mention that during this time some will be protected. Daniel doesn't give us that information. That information comes in the book of Revelation, where we see the woman fleeing into the wilderness where she's protected. Daniel does not talk about that. Okay? And that can throw people off. Give me a 7 if you're with me out there and you know the difference between a time, times, and half a time in the book of Daniel, where Daniel's only revealing a war and pressure and persecution, and how it's used in the book of Revelation, where we see the same pressure and persecution, but we also see God protecting this woman. And so we see a distinction in the book of Revelation when it's used, and in the book of Daniel when it's used. Does that mean it's 2 different time periods? Absolutely not. Because we see from other passages that this time of protection synchronizes with the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11 when they're protected. Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's continue here for a second. The key to understanding this is that this woman is protected. That is the key. We're going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to show you guys when we read the chapter, and we're going to get to that. So here we go. These are the 2 terms. This is the connection that is important in Revelation 12. Part 2, let's look at it. This is what we learned in part 1. All of these connected through a time, times, and half a time, and the war against the saints. That's part 1. We've already looked at that in the last few weeks. Today, we're looking at part 2. We're seeing how Revelation 12 takes that time, and half a time, and the war against the saints that we learned before, and it connects it all together. Now we have a connection between 1260 days to a time, times, and half a time, and the war against the saints. We're seeing it all in Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. This is what we're learning today. How does this term 1260 days fit into these other terms, into these other ideas that we're learning about this 3.5-year time period? How does it connect to the time, times, and half a time in Daniel? How does it connect with the war against the saints we read about in Daniel? And Revelation 12 gives us that information. Okay? Now, when we're done with part 2, you will see how 1260 days identifies to the same 3.5-year time period. Okay? And by way of implicity, you will know that the 1260 days by this yellow line actually is the same time period that the book of Daniel is talking about. We use yellow lines when the scriptures don't give us the clear language. In other words, it's not written down in Daniel anywhere that there's a 1260 days. It's only mentioned in Revelation 12. We can make this inference or this connection by way of implicity because of the understanding that we're deriving here when we read Revelation chapter 12 and we understand the time of protection and the war that's happening simultaneously. We can infer that when Daniel's talking about a time of war, that he's just leaving that part out. He's not including that. It's not important to Daniel. It's important to John, and it's important to the future prophecies that we're having in the book of Revelation. For some reason, God's giving us that information. What does the book of Daniel say? Seal up that information for now. A lot of it's been sealed up until the time of the end. When we understand the book of Revelation more, we're going to understand some of the stuff that was sealed up in the book of Daniel and that wasn't clearly understood. In fact, some of the stuff in the book of Daniel didn't even understand. He was being revealed by the angel, but he still didn't understand it all. And we are able to now understand that which Daniel didn't even understand more clearly. So we're seeing more clearly now about this 3.5-year time period, that it is indeed a time of war against God's people and believers, but there's also this protection element that takes place. And we're going to learn more about who that's for, who it's not for, in future lessons. Don't go anywhere and stay tuned. To understand the Great Tribulation hour and all the different terms and all the different places it's used in the Bible, to understand it fully, comprehensively, it is a great deal of effort. Okay? It's not something that can happen very easily. All right, so here we go. We'll eventually see how the 1260 days connects to Revelation 11. Because remember, the 1260 days is a time of protection. All right? A time, times, and half a time is a time of war and protection. So when God's speaking of 1260 days about somebody in the scriptures, he's only referring to their protection and nothing else. In Revelation 11, we see 3.5 years of protection for the 2 witnesses. They're not bothered by the Antichrist for 3.5 years. In Revelation 12, we see the woman fleeing into the wilderness for 3.5 years. She is fed and nourished for 3.5 years. But we learn that that comes to an end. And we learn that the 2 witnesses are killed. But the 144,000 are not killed. Hence, the scriptures are true that say some will remain alive at the 7th trumpet when the rapture takes place, when the resurrection rapture takes place. Some will remain alive, while others are appointed to die. Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 to 11, they say to God, go take vengeance on us. He says, wait until your brothers are dead as you were. Some are appointed to die. Others are not appointed to die. There will be some that remain left alive and some who must die. So this is a clear biblical principle. I'm not making it up. How does it apply to the Great Tribulation hour? When we read these chapters here in front of you, Revelation 11, 12, and 13, and when we study Daniel 7 and 12, and we look at all these terms, and we study the scriptures closely, we start to understand how this all fits together very nicely. Like pieces to the puzzle, it all clicks, and there's no contradictions. All right? The only contradiction to this is what we've been taught wrong. And all the theories and all the stuff that we've been taught over the years to think about this 3.5 year period and all this stuff, because there's been so much wrong doctrine about it, it can be hard to just simply see what the Bible's showing us. So let's just see what the Bible's showing us and try to forget everything that we've learned over the years. All right? So let's continue here. And then at some point, we're going to see Revelation 13 connect to 42 months. Because although Revelation 13 is connected to a time, times, and half a time, only because it talks about the same war, Revelation 13 does not use the term a time, times, and half a time. It uses the term 42 months. Why? Because it's only talking about the Antichrist having power. You see, Revelation 13 would use the term 1260 days if God was talking about protecting someone. In Revelation 13, God is not talking about protecting anyone in that passage. He's talking about the Antichrist crushing Christians. The same thing Daniel's talking about in Daniel 7 and 12 with the time, times, and half a time, wearing out the saints. We can really assume that that 42 months is the same time period as the time, times, and half a time, right? Which will give us all these lines at some point, which is very, very complicated at the moment. But at some point, you'll understand every single one of these yellow lines makes absolutely perfect sense when you start understanding these bits and pieces little by little. It'll all make sense. It's not as hard as you think. All right, so let's look again. Here's the first connection. Here's the second connection. We're going to connect the term 1260 days. And we're eventually going to show you 1260 days in Revelation 11. Both Revelation 11 and Revelation 12 talk about what? If they talk about 1260, what are they talking about? They're talking about protection. There's protection in those chapters. Although Revelation 12 also talks about crushing the Christians. So what's in Revelation 12? The term time, times, and half a time also. So anytime God's talking about hurting the Christians, it's going to include either 42 months or a time, times, and half a time. Whenever God's talking about only protecting someone, he uses the term 1260 days. In Revelation 12, we see both. Why do we see both? Because both are happening at the same time. Give me an amen if you understand that. We're going to see in Revelation 11 at some point coming up that both terms 42 months and 1260. It's the only chapter that uses 42 months and 1260. Why? Because we see both. We see power given to the Antichrist people, the Gentiles, and we see power given to the 2 witnesses to be protected. Both terms are necessary. Then why isn't God using a time, times, and half a time? Well, because nobody's being killed in that, and there's no, while the war is going on, there's protection here. Nobody's dying. Nobody's dying, and he's not pointing out the fact that anybody's dying. In Revelation 11, he's not pointing out the fact that anybody's dying. He just simply wants everyone to know that there's 2 groups of people with 2 different kinds of power. The 2 witnesses have power to call fire down from heaven. They're supernaturally protected. The Antichrist can't hurt them. Nobody can hurt them. And the power is given to the Gentiles to trample down the outer court of the temple for 3.5 years. They have power to do that. All right, so I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the more you hear it, the more it'll sink in, the more you're expanding your awareness and understanding, And when we get to those chapters, you will understand them a whole lot better. Okay, let's continue. So this little connection here, anytime you see a yellow line, it's a line that we can infer or deduce that there's a connection there, even though it's not written in the book clearly. So that's what the yellow lines are. The reason why we know 1260 days is part of the time, times, and half a time is because both terms are used in Revelation chapter 12. Both terms are used in Revelation chapter 12. There's a time of protection and a time of war, both. So we understand that. Let's get back to that later. Right now, we're into part 2, which does infer that it's talking about the same time, times, and half a time that Daniel's talking about, because it mentions it. And so these are all connected together through Revelation chapter 12. That's the key. Revelation chapter 12 is the key. So study Revelation chapter 12 closer. We're going to look at this closer. Let's look at it. Part 2, Revelation chapter 12, 1260 days to a time, times, and half a time, right here. And we looked at this connection, and we're going to emphasize this. Show it's the same time period. Okay, let's get into this. We will identify that the 1260 days is specific to protection. However, we will also see that both protection and war against the saints is happening at the same time in Revelation 12. All right? The important terms to remember about 1260 days, just as a quick reminder, the term 1260 days refers to a time of protection. 1260 days of protection is happening while the Antichrist is making war against the saints. 1260 days of protection is not for everyone. And when the 1260 days of protection ends, some of the protected people will be killed, while a remnant will remain protected. Okay? So we're looking at 1260 days of protection while the Antichrist is making war against the saints. All right. This also reflects in Revelation 11. We talked about that, where the two witnesses are also protected while the Gentiles are trampling down the city. So Revelation 12 and Revelation 11 both show a kind of protection for someone and power given to the enemy at the same time. Okay, so let's look at this. Revelation 12, it mentions 1260 days and a time, times, and half a time both. Protection only in this part where it talks about it. They should feed her. And then in this part where she flees for nourishment, it says also that there's war. Now you can see right here, the top part, when 1260 days is mentioned for protection, there's no mention of, hurting her. But down at the bottom, when we see a time, times, and half a time, although there's protection, we see that the dragon goes after the remnant of her seed and kills people. So the term time, times, and half a time is used in reference to what? War against the saints. We learned that already. But we see protection for some at the same time. This is very important to make this association, to make this fully, completely comprehended and understood. If we do not understand that a time, times, and half a time in Revelation chapter 12 is going to be a time of war against the saints and a time of nourishing and protecting the woman in the wilderness, if we do not understand that one term includes both protection and war, then we will not be able to understand any further. There's some key hurdles that we have to make as we process through all this, as we progress along in this Bible study. There's key points that have to be nailed down. Okay, so do you guys see that here in this? Give me a 7 if you see that, and hopefully you do. All right, so let's continue. So this connection connects down there. We've already seen that. I think what we're going to do here is we're eventually going to open up the Bible and look at it real close. Okay, 1260 days in Revelation chapter 12 is mentioned there. She's protected. She's nourished. And then a time, times, and half a time, there's war against the saints, persecuting the woman. Okay. But she's nourished as well. Both of these bring nourishment in. Two different groups of people. I think that's what I wanted to point out here. I think that's the next thing we need to point out here. As we're learning about the 1260 days, we know that it's a time of protection, But there's two different groups being protected, and we got to really point that out, okay? We got to point that out. The 1,260 days is protection, probably protection, permanent protection, while a time, times, and half a time is indicating that there is going to be some of the Christians hurt. And he goes around the world hurting the Christians around the world, but the two witnesses also die. So which group are the two witnesses in? I don't really know. Are the two witnesses in? Well, obviously, they're in the group that's not protected permanently, because they wouldn't die if they were protected permanently. All right? So they are obviously not, they're in the protected group, but they're not protected permanently. Like the 144,000 do not die. Okay, so let's continue. Two different groups of people are protected. All right? The woman that flees into the wilderness for 1,260 days is protected with food. And the same woman that flees into the wilderness for a time, times, and half a dime is nourished. All right? Two different groups of people, perhaps. I got this like this, so we can perhaps think that there has to be two different groups of people, because when the woman is protected in the wilderness, it says the dragon goes after her. Goes after the remnant of her seed. We're going to read that in a minute. It's very important you understand that the woman in the wilderness who is nourished, the woman in the wilderness who is fed, is safe. But then the scripture says that the dragon goes after the other Christians. Clear as day, and we're going to read that in good detail here in just a moment. Okay? So I think we're getting ready to look at the scriptures right now. I think it's time to just simply look at the scriptures a little closer here. I can go back over this in a minute. Yeah, we'll do a review on this in a minute. Review after study scriptures. Okay, so let's shrink this down. Let's look at the Bible for a second. Let's look at Revelation chapter 11. Are you guys with me? You guys bored out there? Give me a 7 if you're alive and with me out there. You guys with me? You guys having your own Bible study? You guys are probably studying something else, aren't you? What are you guys studying out there? Let me know. Okay, good. You're with me? Okay, good. All right, guys. Now let's read it. Let's read Revelation chapter 12 ourselves. All right? Let's read it verse by verse. Okay? And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman, clothed in the sun and moon under her feet, and her crown was 12 stars. And she, being with child, travailed in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this is just the battle between God's people and Satan. Jesus and his followers, Jesus and Israel, the 12 tribes, which lead into the remnant of her seed, which is the Gentile Christians. We're going to see that in a minute. This is going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Big enmity between God's seed and Satan's seed. Okay? And his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them down. That's the angels. The dragon stood before the woman and was ready to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, part of this is what happened at the crucifixion, at the cross, right? Well, the dragon has always tried to hurt Israel and destroy Israel throughout the ages, with Haman and down with Esther and the king of Persia and all that stuff. We read in the book of Esther to genocide the entire nation of Israel. You could say that's part of this prophecy. But particularly this could be Jesus being born as a virgin. We see King Herod trying to kill the baby, just like Pharaoh did with Moses. And he was protected. But then we see that he was caught up into heaven. Let's see what it says here. And she brought forth the man-child who was to rule the nations with a rod of iron. and her child was caught up to the throne of God. So that's clearly the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he was caught up into heaven, and Satan tried to kill him and did kill him. And Satan didn't know that that was going to be working against him, though. So the death of Jesus actually was victory, but Satan did not know that. So anyway, he tried to kill Jesus. Jesus did die, but Jesus was caught up or raised and had victory over death. So that's what we're seeing. Now, let's start with verse 6. This is important. So the woman was caught up. The child, Jesus, was caught up, and it just simply says, the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath prepared a place that she should feed her. Let me just tell you that this is a very general statement. Okay? God wants us to know that there will be some protection for this group of people. Now, this woman has to do with the 12 stars of Israel. This woman gave birth to Jesus. This is clearly Israel, or the 144,000. This woman is either Israel or Israelites, which include the 144,000, or it's just the 144,000. I do not know. But that's who this woman is. I am fully persuaded that this is not the Gentile believers. This is not the Gentile believers. Okay? Because we're learning that the Gentile believers do not have any protection. They're in that group. Remember, we talked about the two groups of people. Some are protected, some are not. And even those that are protected, some of them lose their protection. Right? So here we see a woman that goes into the wilderness where she's protected. Now, this is a general statement. He's going to come back to this statement because he wants to interrupt it with some information. God's going to tell us about a war in heaven. Okay? He needs to back up before he finishes this, because this dragon up here that was ready to devour the woman was not kicked out of heaven yet. When we read up here that this dragon was ready to devour the child when he was born, that's not after the war of heaven with Michael and the angels. That's coming soon in the end times. So the dragon was trying to devour the child, and Satan still has access to heaven at that time. He really does. And so God is just showing us that this war has been going on with the dragon and Jesus and the seed. And then God's saying that this woman, this is all about the end times, that she flees into the wilderness for 3.5 years. And then God's pausing for a minute and says, okay, now there's a war in heaven. Now this dragon is kicked out. See, this dragon is kicked out. This dragon's kicked out. That's why he's coming after this woman. Okay? That's what's going on here. He was ready to devour the child. That was back 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the child was caught up into heaven. All right? And then now he's talking about the end times, that she fled for 3.5 years. For 3.5 years, she was nourished. Look at this. She should feed her. Or have the Jews been nourished throughout the last 2,000 years? Some people might say, well, this is talking about the last 2,000 years, or this is really each day is 1,000 years, and line it up with some other kind of historical event and say, oh, this happened. And sometimes people are successful with lining up things or making it appear that the dates line up properly and all this stuff. This is not talking about anything that's happened during the last 2,000 years. This is talking about the last days. This is talking about the 1,260 days, the last 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation hour, and Michael is going to be kicked out of heaven, finally. Michael is going to be kicked out of heaven. I'm sorry, not Michael. Michael's going to kick the devil out. So Michael is going to kick the dragon, the devil, the serpent, Satan, all his different names, and he's going to be kicked out, and his angels are going to be kicked out with him. Look at that. His angels are going to be kicked out with him. Okay? That hasn't happened yet. This hasn't happened yet. The woman fleeing into the wilderness for 3.5 years. That hasn't happened yet. So here in Revelation 12, we're learning that Israel The 144,000 are going to be persecuted. They're going to be sealed in Revelation chapter 7. They're going to realize who the Messiah is because they're going to wake up because of what? The two witnesses are going to be waking up Israel. Israel is going to wake up out of her blindness. Israel is going to finally realize who the true Messiah is. A very small percentage of them, guys. A very small remnant of Israelites will be saved. All right? We're not talking about the whole nation and the president and Benjamin Netanyahu and all those military leaders and all that. They're going to perish, man. Israel has a secular Israel. See, when we think about Israel, I want you guys to understand there's a spiritual Israel, Romans chapter 2, and there's a secular Israel. Just like in each one of us, there is the spiritual man and a natural man. Can I get an amen if you're with me out there? Do you understand that there's a spiritual man and a natural man? Corinthians talks about the natural man. Corinthians talks about the spiritual man. You guys with me? Okay, so Israel here, Israel can be viewed the same way. Israel is a lost, secular, evil nation, just like all the other evil nations in the world that are going to perish at the day of the Lord. However, Israel will be saved. And whenever somebody starts putting Israel down and not understanding that that's the secular Israel, the worldly Israel, and they don't understand that God's name is on that nation and he's promised a covenant to save them, all 12 tribes will be saved. A small remnant of each tribe, 144,000. It's probably just a number. God uses numbers for reasons, but oftentimes it won't be mathematically precise. In other words, there are 7 spirits of God, but there's names for the Spirit. There's many, many names for the Spirit of God. We've counted more than 7, just like there's 12 tribes of Israel, but in the Bible you can see God using different names for the 12. It won't be the same 12, in other words. So it's not that which one makes up the number, it's just 12. It's just 7. It's just 144,000. So I happen to believe it's probably going to be more than 144,000, but definitely a solid 12,000 from each tribe will be ordained as the root government of that nation. And there may be some others that are saved. So I'm willing to believe that because I see God doing that in scriptures in general. So what we're talking about here is this woman fleeing into the wilderness for 1,260 days. Why is that term used? Because God is going to supernaturally what? Feed her there. Feed her there. That's why he's using that term. Now, before he gets into any more details, and the reason why he's only using that term is because he's not giving us any information about anyone being hurt yet. First, he wants to tell us about the war. The war comes, the devil's kicked out, and now let's move on with the rest of the passages. Now we know that the devil's being cast down to earth, right? And so we're going to get into the understanding a little bit more here. Let's continue. Now, there's this little scripture here that talks about an angel announces the end. The angel's just in the middle of this chapter. We get the same kind of announcement that we get in chapter 11, chapter 10. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now has come salvation and strength from God." So periodically in these chapters, we'll just hear God saying the end is coming. And that's what we're seeing here in verse 10. "For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accuses day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives to the death." Now this verse right here is telling us that some are going to die for their faith. So what happened to the protection up here? So he's interjecting some information now. So right now we see fed there. She's fed there for 2,000 years. This is protection for 3.5 years. But then down here, we're starting to read about dying for your faith in verse 11. Okay? "Therefore rejoice. The devil has come down having great wrath because he knows his time is short." Now, we're getting back into the woman again. "When the dragon saw that he was cast to earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child." Look, this is the same woman. Is this the same woman? Give me a 7 if you think this is the same woman. How do we know it's the same woman? Which brought forth the man-child. Do we know this is the same woman? Absolutely sure. It's not a different woman, a different persecution, a different time. It's the same woman, isn't it? Okay? It's the same dragon. Okay? So when we see up here that the woman fled into the wilderness after the child was caught up, all right? Her child was caught up. And then we're starting to read about the end times, about this woman fled into the wilderness for 1,260 days. There's a devil was kicked out. And then we read right here where the dragon persecutes the woman and who had the man-child. That's the same woman. That's also the same time period right here. She fled into the wilderness for 3.5 years, 1,260 days. The dragon persecuted the woman, right? How long? A time times and half a time. It's the same time. Why is God calling it a different name here? How do you know it's the same time? Look, she's nourished. She's nourished. Okay? Now, I've showed you these scriptures over and over and over in the PowerPoint presentation, that the 1,260 days is nourishment. 1,260 days is nourishment. All right? Now we're seeing a time times and half a time is nourishment. Who? The same woman, the same dragon persecuting. It's the same 3.5 years. Give me a 7 if that makes sense to you guys, that this is the same 3.5 years. The 1,260 days and the time times and half a time is the same nourishing time of protection. That's the dragon is coming after the same woman, and it's the same 3.5 years. It's the only way that makes sense to me. It really is. And now, just the little thing about him calling it a different name. Why is he calling it a different name here? Well, let's see. Why is he calling it a different name? I'll show you. Let's find out. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away. And the earth helped the woman, because she's supernaturally protected, and swallowed up the flood. Right? Now look what happens here in the last verse. The dragon was so mad that he could not get the woman because she's supernaturally protected. But while that protection is happening, look what the dragon does. And he went and made war with the remnant of her seed. Does this say that after the 1,260 days, or after the time times and half a time, that he's going to go after 3.5 years, then he's going to go make war with the remnant of her seed? Or is this sounding pretty much like he can't get her because she's got this protection on her? He's so mad that he can't get her that he's going to take that time and go after those who are not protected. And is this not clearly showing us that there are some who will be protected and others who will not be protected? So the dragon was wroth with the woman because he could not get her. It doesn't take 3.5 years to figure out you can't get her. So don't try to say that, well, he tries for 3.5 years to get her and can't. No, he learns real quickly that he can't get her. Right in the very beginning, when she flees into the wilderness, he goes after her and can't get her. It doesn't take 3.5 years to figure that out. It's right at the beginning. So he knows, hey, I can't get this woman. I'm going to go after the remnant of her seed. So who is the remnant of her seed? That's me and you, buddy. Can you type a 7 in if you understand you're the remnant of her seed? You're the remnant of her seed, bro. Sister Karina, you're the remnant of her seed. You are the remnant of her seed, Gentile American Christians. You ain't got no protection. I hate to break it to you. I hate to break it to you. You ain't got no protection. You ain't got no protection. So this is what we're talking about here in Revelation chapter 12. And I'm so glad we're finally getting over this hump here, because this is the key chapter to understanding the whole kit and caboodle of how we know that these are all the same time period, 42 months, 1,260 days, a time times and half a time. Revelation 12, the connection between a time times and half a time and 1,260 days in this chapter teaches us quite clearly that that's the same time period. Okay? So let's get back over to this presentation here and see how much we got left. This should go quick now. It should go pretty quick now because we looked at that chapter there. So here's what we got. The first step of the first connection is a time times and half a time. We connected Revelation 13 because it talks about the same war that those chapters talk about. All right? All right? So now we see that the term time times and half a time is being used in reference to protection. So we know that in Daniel it doesn't mention protection about anybody. Okay? But we know that because we see it in Revelation chapter 12. How many of you understand now, this chart right here that you're looking at, that Daniel does not mention a protection when in terms of the term time times and half a time, in terms of the 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. But Revelation 12 does. Revelation's giving us more information about the 3.5 year time period that Daniel did not give us. Okay? So when Revelation talks about a time times and half a time, it brings in 1,260 days of protection. We know that that's also the same time period, even though Daniel does not mention it. Even though Daniel does not mention it. All right. So Revelation 12 talks about a time of protection. Revelation 12 talks about a war against the saints. Both. Okay? So let's talk about why God is using two different terms. Okay? If I were to tell you a man is an artist and a man is a landscaper and he does both, or a man likes to paint and he likes to do yard work. If a man likes to paint and do yard work and somebody's describing him to someone else, someone may just simply pick one of those traits and describe him. In other words, if I were to describe a guy that likes to paint and do yard work, I might just simply tell you he likes to paint and leave out the yard work part. Or somebody else may describe him as a landscaper and simply leave out the painting side of his character trait. When we get into these books here and the names of these 42 months and everything, sometimes God is just simply talking about the 1,260 days aspect of the 3.5 years. Can I get an amen if you're with me? Are you guys with me? Sometimes God is only referring to the power he gives to the Antichrist, which he calls 42 months. Sometimes God is referring to both the war against the Christians and a time of protection. So he uses a different term for that as well. So just because he's not giving us the fullness in the book of Daniel doesn't mean that the book of Daniel doesn't discerningly include that same time period that Daniel's talking about with protection involved. We don't get that information in Daniel, but that's okay. Daniel didn't talk about that. So I hope you understand how that works. Daniel 12, a time of protection and a time of war. Both. 1,260 days and a time times and half a time is the same exact time period. Okay? We see the same thing in Revelation 11, both protection and power to the Antichrist, and we're not going to get into that too much today because that's a different part coming up. More about the 1,260 study. I could study Revelation 11 a little bit and show you how 1,260 days is a time of protection to the two witnesses, but that's coming up. I don't know if it's necessary to get into that right now because I want you to let this sink into your head. What we learned today about Revelation chapter 12 and what we learned today about a time times and half a time and all these different terms that are used and why God's choosing to use certain terms to explain certain situations and how they all relate to one another in the end, how they're all the same thing really, but depending on how God wants to explain something and what part he's explaining, if he's just explaining the protection part specifically, or if he's going to bring in the trouble that others are going to have, then he's using a different term for that. It's very interesting how God writes and does these things. So in Revelation 11, real quick, what do we got here? We see both. In Revelation 11, I don't want to get into Revelation 11 right now because I don't want you guys, I've been kind of slipping in a little information about these different chapters. It's hard to talk about this stuff without bringing in the other parts because it's so tangly. It's all so connected that you kind of just throw it in a little bit here and there to get you used to it, because it really, really is a tangly web of connections. So let's just see what we got here. I'm getting ahead of myself for sure. So this is what we got today. 1260 days is mentioned in Revelation 11. We know that same 1260 days is also not mentioned in Daniel, but it's the same thing. Okay. I got study Revelation 11 here, but I don't think that I need to do that. So we finished so far part 2. We've connected 1260 days to a time times and half a time and shown you that that's the same time. Okay, that's part 2. So next time we're going to get into part 3, how 42 months connects to a war with the saints. And that should go pretty quickly. I mean, pretty much the next 2 parts should go really fast. So we're going to probably be done with this by next week. This particular 3.5-year Great Tribulation study should be finished next week, I hope. All right, because we got some other things to study. At some point, I want us to go back over all 7 churches and study the letters to the churches, like detailed. Okay? We need to do that before we end this season. I don't even know when we're going to end studying the book of Revelation. I don't know if it's ever going to come to an end, to be honest with you. It's just so much to it.